States and municipalities across the U.S. passed out tens of millions of dollars in COVID-19 rental assistance during the pandemic back in 2020 all the way up until 2023. Now, 5 states are working to try to get some of that money that they say was passed out incorrectly back. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting topic for you today, and it's going over the rental assistance program that had to do with the whole COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so I didn't like the rental assistance from the very beginning because it had so many stipulations to it. They made it basically impossible for some landlords to be able to get any rental assistance whatsoever. They also tied the rental assistance to the landlord's ability to be able to evict tenants. So in some cases, if a tenant merely applied for rental assistance, the landlord would be unable to evict that tenant even after the eviction moratorium ended. So yeah, the rental assistance program, it had a lot of issues, and it did not pay the landlord all of the money that was actually owed to them. So, I have big gripes with it. So part of the issue is that it's a socialist program. It discouraged these tenants from going back to work because they were getting all of their bills paid for free. And it protected tenants who did not need to stay in these units. Basically, there was a lot of scammers. There were a lot of people saying, I need this rental assistance, even when they didn't need it. And some of these states that are now asking for that money back, well, they looked in their records and they said, hey, this tenant, for whatever reason, wasn't eligible for that rental assistance, so we want our money back. But you know what? They're not going to go after the tenant for that money. No, they're going to come after us, the landlords, obviously, because we're the ones who, in their minds, they perceive us as having money. And, the system is set up basically to tax us, to punish us, and let the tenant do whatever they want. So I imagine that if anyone is going to get into any trouble for not paying this money back, it's probably going to be the landlords out there who receive this rental assistance through no fault of their own, mind you. Okay. So if they hadn't put so many stipulations on it, right? Like a lot of the rental assistance program was only for people who made below a certain amount of money, like 80% of the area's median income. And so if you made more than that amount, then your landlord wasn't eligible to receive rental assistance in a lot of cases. But the funny thing about that is that says nothing on whether you actually lost your job during the pandemic, whether you actually needed the assistance or not. They would just look at, oh, well, yeah, you make too much money. Yeah, you lost your job, but you make too much money. And yeah, you suffered due to the pandemic, but you make too much money. So your landlord doesn't get to get paid. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. All the rules and stipulations they put on the money, right? It made it so that landlords oftentimes didn't receive anything. Now, I personally did receive some rental assistance money from my state, okay? But it did not cover all of the money the tenant owed me. And surprise, surprise, guess who I ended up having to evict after the pandemic money ran out? Okay, I still had to get rid of that tenant because they still were unable to pay the rent on their own, even after getting that government assistance. So, the only thing they really were doing was delaying the inevitable. They did not prevent these people from being evicted. They prevented them from being evicted during the pandemic for a few months. And then these people, they still had the same money issues months, even years later in a lot of cases. So, yeah, it's a nightmare. And it created this system of dependence, of socialism, where these tenants are dependent upon the government to pay their bills for them. We don't need that here in this country. You see what happened when they started printing money, right? Inflation shot through the roof. This is a negative effect. You're making our money worthless if you just keep printing money and then passing it out to people who aren't working, aren't producing something for that money. Okay, so I'm on a rant. Let's get into this article. Okay, it's quite interesting. This article is coming from NBCnews.com, and it says, pandemic aid officials who overpaid vulnerable renters are saying, we messed up, pay us back. Unlike emergency unemployment aid, rental relief programs don't show many signs of fraud, but efforts are underway in at least 5 states to claw back improperly issued money, sowing confusion among landlords and tenants. Yeah, they say, oh, well, there isn't a lot of signs of fraud. That's because they didn't do any verification on a lot of that money that they passed out. If you don't do any verification, there's not going to be any fraud. You know, if somebody can just sign on a dotted line swearing that they faced a pandemic hardship without having to prove anything, without having to show any evidence, well, there's still a fraud. There's just, the government in their mind, oh, well, that person isn't a fraud. You know? What ridiculous nonsense. Anyway, let's get into the article. State and local agencies that distributed federal aid to renters facing eviction during the pandemic are now scrambling to claw back millions of dollars in overpayments. Officials in at least 5 states have been sending tenants and landlords a flurry of letters, typically citing clerical errors or other bureaucratic mix ups, demanding that portions of the temporary relief money be returned. Some of the notices ask for 5-figure sums within weeks. Details about the clawbacks are hard to come by, but NBC News identified efforts over the past year in Minnesota, Delaware, Texas, North Carolina, and Alaska to recover some of the more than $46 billion in emergency rental assistance that Congress allocated in two sweeping relief packages in 2020 and 2021. The excess funds, which cover a small fraction of that aid, are meant to be returned to the U.S. Treasury or reallocated to others in need. So here's my question, right? When they claw that money back, are they saying that the landlords did not actually experience the loss? No, I don't think they're saying that at all. I think what they're saying is, well, this person, the tenant who applied for it, didn't fill out the paperwork correctly, or maybe they weren't eligible according to the terms of our, agreement for this rental assistance, right? So the landlord, regardless of anything, probably was not getting paid their rent. The tenant might not have been able to pay the rent. Yet they're saying, well, yes, you guys, you were suffering hardship during the pandemic. The landlord didn't get paid the rent, and it was all the fault of the government, but the government doesn't want to make you whole. We want you to give us our money back, right? And in many cases, tens of thousands of dollars. Think about a tenant who's paying $2,000 a month rent and didn't pay rent for 10 months. That's 20 grand right there. So what do you think? The landlord's going to make that 20 grand appear out of thin air? No, that money's gone. Where did it go? Well, the landlord probably used the money to pay the mortgage payment, the taxes, the property taxes, the insurance, all their other expenses that they accumulated by keeping that tenant in there and being unable to evict them due to their eviction moratorium. Okay? So you created the problem. Now you're sitting there telling me that the landlord has to pay you all this money back. What a joke. It is horrible to do this to somebody years later trying to claw back tens of thousands of dollars. Okay? Now, that money likely is gone, but you know what? They will never, ever let it go. They are so greedy. They are so ridiculous, and it just stinks. This whole thing just stinks. Man, they'll put a lien on your property. They will take your property away from you if you don't pay that money back. See, this is why so many landlords didn't even want to get that money. Okay, they just were like, you know what? We'll just eat the loss. And hopefully this thing ends quickly. It didn't end quickly in a lot of cases. It took a very, very long time. In some cases, 3.5 years. But imagine having your property taken from you because the government suddenly wants to claw their money back. Hey, this is the kind of nightmare that we have been put into. Details. Oh, I'm sorry. But with little public guidance from Washington, some recipients are scrambling to dash off checks or appeal the requests, even though many remain vulnerable to many of the same housing disruptions the now discontinued aid was meant to blunt. Lynette Lopez, a single mother of two, and okay, I'm not going to read the story of this tenant, right? I don't give a crap about the tenant because they're not going to the tenant to claw that money back. The tenant will just be like, I ain't got the money, and they won't have anything they can take from the tenant. But if the landlord says, oh, well, I ain't got the money, they will put a lien on the property. They'll take the property from the landlord. Okay. Yeah, so, like the tenant has nothing to lose in this whole situation. This is just bad for landlords. And, of course, the article doesn't even, let's see if they further down, if they actually talk to a landlord. It says one Delaware property manager told NBC News it had to evict someone who was already behind in rent after receiving a recoupment notice that put the tenant further in arrears. The state has told the landlord it's still on the hook for the repayment, and the company hasn't determined how to proceed. So they talked to a property manager. They said that they took, because the tenant had received this money and wasn't eligible, right? They just added it. They were like, okay, well, we'll pay the state back, and now we're gonna have to evict this tenant because the tenant hasn't paid his rent. This is a bad situation. I'm laughing about it, right? But why in the world are they trying to claw back this money as though this is like some kind of scam? In the cases where there's true fraud going on, then yes, I believe they should, go after those scammers, right? But this does not sound like that's the situation I'm talking about here. This sounds like they issued the money by mistake, and the tenant thought they were eligible, the landlord thought they were eligible. So, the state made a mistake. The state needs to go ahead, eat that loss, and shut the heck up because you're just making things worse. But anyway, I'm going to put a link to this article down in the description below so that you can, get a good view of this. Fortunately, they're not doing this anywhere where I live or invest. But I mean, they were talking about like North Carolina and Texas. These are landlord friendly states. So, this could happen everywhere. Who knows what's going to happen with all this nonsense going into the future. But like I was saying, I never liked the rental assistance program. I always thought it was a joke, and no tenant should have ever been prevented from being evicted, with the basis of, oh, the government's going to pay your rent for you.